Well, I think we get started. So welcome everyone. You made it to the second day of this summer school. That's great. I have three small organizational points. Like first, we have some new people coming. So like the guys from Cuba coming, and I don't know if anyone else came yesterday or in the morning. So welcome in Brno. Welcome at BUT. Second point is just minor. Tomorrow we were expected to switch from this lecture room to this G202 in the afternoon, but we can keep this one the whole day. So slight change for tomorrow. We'll stay the whole day here. And third is important, please all stop with Renata to do the paperwork. So Renata is in her office, any break, lunch break, after the session, whatever, but she needs to see all of you guys to do some paperwork, especially the ones that are paid by JSALT. If you do not do the paperwork, you don't get paid, it's simple. So now my pleasure to announce our morning speaker, and this is Hynek. Hynek is basically one of the real gurus of our field worldwide. He did his master's here at BUT in the old times. He did a PhD at the University of Tokyo, and he's currently a research professor here at BUT and still holds a position of Professor Emeritus at Johns Hopkins University. I think like Hynek gathered all the possible accolades that you can imagine in our field. So he's like ISCA fellow, he's IEEE Life fellow, he has got these medals from ISCA and Flanagan, speech and audio medal from the IEEE, many publications. And I think actually if Hynek told you his life story, he would spend just half the lecture telling you like what happened to him and to the people around. So I hope we will get this maybe at some other occasion, like in the evening in a restaurant or something. So this is the official vita. What I need to stress is Hynek's influence on this group. Basically, Hynek was really instrumental for what happens here in Brno. I think if I remember well, it all started with my PhD committee back in '98. So my French supervisor, Gérard Chollet, told me, do you know Hynek Hermansky? I say, I have no idea about Hynek Hermansky. So I Googled. Google was kind of half working at that time. And it was not Hynek, but Hynek. So we contacted Hynek and he agreed, and I was very happy to sit on my PhD committee. And then we kind of like got more and more in touch, and that was the time where the basis of the group was created on the Hill at the electrical engineering. And now between 2000 and 2002, I would say almost everyone in the group that was pretty small at the time joined Hynek in his OGI lab for some time, including me. And well, that was in 2001, and frankly, I was not terribly happy uphill. So I thought about like what to do in my life. And when I was in Hynek's lab, I got a call from Pavel Zemčík. Pavel Zemčík at the time was the future head of Department of Computer Graphics and Multimedia here at the faculty, and then the dean. And he just told me, okay, well, Honzo, you are doing this speech and I do computer graphics, so why don't you go downhill, like to newly created FIT? And I told him, oh, I don't know. And in a day, the deal was done. So that's why we are here in the valley at the FIT. Then I'd like to continue with Hynek. Then he moved to IDIAP, again some people with him. Petr Motlíček is still at IDIAP and he's there as leader of the speech group. Hynek was also behind our joining of the first real research European projects in speech recognition, M4 AMIDA back in the 2002 and on, and also managed the BBN guys to take us into our first US projects like DARPA RATS and IARPA Babel that were quite important. We were also in very intensive touch with Hynek when he was the director of CSLP at Hopkins. And now I should not call it retirement, like it's a very active retirement at BUT, and we are just very happy to have Hynek here at BUT. This might surprise you. I grabbed some photos. So this is basically the people in 2001, including Hynek, Petr Motlíček, my wife, Franta Gräsel, Hynek with his wife Charlie, like 30 years younger than now, I think. That's the BUT group at the time. The guy in the backpack is Tomáš, who is now your age, basically just finishing his master's and probably entering a PhD in France. And that's Hynek's OGI group. I'm not there, but like you would recognize many of the people. So I wanted to show you this, and I'm very happy that Hynek accepted to talk at this summer school.
Very generous introduction. I think that Honza is, of course, overdoing it, but I mean, it's very pleasant to listen. I wish it was me, actually. Is it okay? Yeah. Yeah. So with all these achievements, don't worry, if you hang around long enough, you will get there. I mean, it's only a question of age. I mean, it's not, you just have to be there and wait, and everything comes to you. I want to talk about human hearing and speech engineering today. Some of my students may recognize some of these slides. If you do, it's good, because it means that you remember at least a little bit from the classes which we had together, so this is a test. And other than that, I hope there will be enough things new that everybody will at least find something interesting. Human hearing and speech engineering. Of course, you may sort of start thinking, oh my God, Hynek is going to talk about something like, why should we build airplanes which flap wings? Why should we build the cars which walk, right? Why should we build the machines with the ears? Well, of course, I mean, you know, it may happen that you start building an airplane and you do what these guys did. This is actual patent from 1888, or I believe, at the end of the last 19th century. And you see, these people did everything right. I mean, they did everything, all the what's and how's, okay. What, they want to fly, so they observe, and how, they observe that birds are moving wings, and they have feathers, so they try their best to copy the nature. But of course, you know, they didn't fly. And needless to say that this patent, I think, wasn't one of the more successful ones. And so what these persons were doing wrong, they were doing everything what they observed. They copied the nature, but at the end, it didn't really work. I want to give you a little story for the beginning, while people will be dropping in. I will tell you about Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton was spending 20% of his time on physics and 80% of his time on alchemy. And here is the example of what Isaac Newton tried to do when he wanted to get the gold. So I won't read through that, but basically he describes all the steps. Yeah? First you collect the body fluids, then you put it in a fire, then you get the black matter, then you put it in a fire, you get the white matter and mercury, and then you ferment it twice, and then you may get a philosopher's stone, which you can use for building the gold. So again, I mean, Isaac Newton describes what he wanted to do, right? I mean, he described what and described how. So, and he optimized the thing. He tried to keep the black matter in a little bit longer and white matter a little bit shorter, and observe if he gets gold. If it reminds you the way we build speech recognizers, don't be disturbed, because we all do it that way. We try, you put things together, we try this, we try that, and we optimize slightly, and at the end, maybe we'll get the good recognition rate. Isaac Newton was actually smarter than this. I mean, as I told you, 20% of the time he was worried about real things. So he worried about how is it that apple fell on his head and discovered the law of gravity. But in the process, he might be also wondering, why is it that apples are red? What makes them red, and what makes the leaves green? So he looked into nature of the colors and light. and discovered that he can break the white light into the rainbow, and then he understood something. He finally discovered that the white light contains the waves with different wavelengths, and depending on the wavelength, there is a different color, and you can take it apart and then put it back together. That's exactly what alchemists were trying to do with the various materials, but he succeeded with the light here. So what is interesting, alchemy basically tries to start with some data, and then you figure out how to process it, and you're looking at the result, and if it doesn't work, it goes through the feedback loop, and you try again and again and again. Scientists actually does something else. What you notice that what Isaac Newton did here, he was asking the question why things are in a certain way. Why is it that the apples are falling on his head? Why is it that apples are red and leaves are green? So what we should be doing something similar to what Isaac Newton was doing. We should be asking why certain technology works, why does it break, and how does it break? How can we reuse the knowledge which we obtain in the future systems? And what is it that we are learning about the problem, if we work in speech, about the problem of speech? So, of course, eventually people who were building flying machines also figured out that what they have to know is why. Why is it that birds are staying in the air? It's not because they have feathers. It's even not because they are moving their wings, because there is a Bernoulli force, there is a second Newton law, and this is what keeps them in the air, and that's how we're building airplanes nowadays. And that's how we succeeded to fly all over the world. So but after this long introduction, let's start with the real thing. Why is it we speak the way we speak? This is something which I want to address today and discuss that with you. Speech is going like this. You have certain message in your head, in the brain here. Let me see if that works. Of course, here. In the brain, and then you put commands into your vocal tract, generate a speech. Speech is this. Speech changes in acoustic pressure. It falls on the human ear and goes to human brain, and everything is all right. The message gets across. This is what the speech is. And how does it possibly happen? You know, I haven't been here around at the time, but I can imagine there might have been something like this. 400 million years, actually, I discovered recently. I was saying before, I was saying 200, but it might have been as long as 400 million years. Animals got out of the water, and they had to change their hearing system so that it works in the air. So it has to change. It was evolving for a long time in a way that animal can survive in the environment, and eventually it evolved to the shape where it is now. Homo sapiens has pretty much hearing which is very similar or even not identical to ours. And actually other animals too. I mean, reptiles have very similar hearing. Birds have very similar hearing. Of course, mammals, all of them have a very similar hearing. But Homo sapiens decided that they want to speak. How do they go about it? Well, they had to use what they had, and they start building the speech on top of the hearing. This is my hypothesis. You may believe it or not, but I will try to convince you that that might have been that way. And after 200,000 years, very shortly, we came to the point, this is Roman Jakobson, a very famous linguist. Basically, the human beings as we know them today, they communicate by speech. So I'm asking, is it possible that human hearing evolved on top of, the human speech evolved on top of human hearing? If this is so, then we should look at a hearing, and we should look at speech, and we may see some similarities. And if we do, I will always try to point out, because obviously I try to test this hypothesis. Hypothesis you can only test, you can never prove anything. But I will try to bring some evidence where I think maybe supporting my hypothesis. So let's start to look into hearing. What is hearing? Hearing is not this. This is ear, but this is what you see, and this is, of course, input to the whole system. It's like a microphone, but it's more sophisticated than a microphone. And I know that the first time I saw it, I thought, I leave this for the medical doctors. This is just far too complicated. So I made a simpler picture here. And this is the ear as I see it. I basically stretched out the cochlea. And so what we have here, this is what we see. This is the pretty part, right? Then there is an eardrum. And eardrum is moving as the acoustic pressure is changing. And as eardrum is moving, there is a small set of bones, 3 bones, smallest bones in the human body, which also move. And they make this membrane here, the oval window, moving, and that connects the thing into the most important part of the hearing, which is inner ear. Inner ear is filled with fluid. Actually, fluid is very similar to seawater, that some people say this is a very convincing evidence that we did come from the ocean, because that still is this part is not that different. This part of hearing is not that different from what fish has. So what's happening inside is that there is a organ of Corti here. It's a textorial membrane, and on the textorial membrane is a basilar membrane, and on basilar membrane there are hairs. And the whole thing is moving because there is also a round window here and a round window, basically oval window, round window, they are moving together. So there is a fluid movement inside the inner ear. What is interesting for us as engineers is this. There is this, as I told you, basilar membrane, and basilar membrane has a particular property. It's stiff on one part and is very pliable on the other part. And as the sound comes with certain frequency, it's there is a wave created here, and it grows, and then it dies. The moment when the wave hits the part where the basilar membrane cannot follow the movements anymore, basically it dies. So for high frequencies, only this part of the basilar membrane is active. For low frequencies, the whole basilar membrane is active, and maximum is at the very end. So this is an ingenious design of the nature, how to do the spectral analysis of the sounds. Obviously, it must be somehow important, because if you look at the basilar membrane and cochlea, there's most of the animals I was mentioning, including the reptiles, they do have a very similar mechanism. As a matter of some of the insects tries to emulate that on their legs, So this is important. How to take signal divided into different frequency components seems to be important thing. People were talking about that for a long time. Von Helmholtz in 19th century was already hypothesizing that. And von Helmholtz, who was Hungarian engineer actually, but he got a Nobel Prize for medicine, without any doubt proved that, because what he did, he spent the time drilling the holes in the cochleas and was looking through the microscope at the movement of the cochlea. What he observed was that indeed, for low frequencies, maximum of the movement was 31 millimeters from the oval window, and for very low frequencies, for the high frequencies was 13 millimeters from the oval window. And so you can see here something which looks like a bank of bandpass filters, except that it's all done mechanically. It is very interesting. I wish some people actually try to build a mechanical equivalence of the cochlea. As far as I know, nobody succeeded, but it would be nice if somebody comes with a microphone like that. Interesting thing is for you guys is that you can get a Nobel Prize for the wrong result. But when von Helmholtz reported these results, people said, well, it seems to be okay, except we think that our hearing is much sharper. Indeed it is. Eventually, the moment the Nobel Prize was awarded, everybody starts looking into things because they kind of smell the blood, right? They think maybe we can also get a Nobel Prize. Anyways, very quickly, people discovered that what was the problem on von Bekesky was that he was working with dead animals. And dead animals, a dead ear is something very different from a live ear. This is a very good lecture for us because I will try to mention it later over and over again. Hearing is active, and actually if you start doing measurements on a live hearing, obviously it's much more difficult, but it was done, you see much sharper responses. So that ear is here. This is from Bekesky, and people later after him, they discovered that there is a very important part which sharpens the window. There's yet another important part. The whole system is very nonlinear. What happens for the very low intensities, 20 dB, the response is very sharp. But as we increase the intensity, eventually the whole response is more like a low-pass filter rather than band-pass filter. So essentially, the system depends on the intensity of the signal, meaning the whole thing is nonlinear. So this is the important part. This is the basilar membrane. But what happens after that? After basilar membrane, here we have a basilar membrane. Let's see, when I lose the scene, here it is. Here we have a basilar membrane, and actually, in the real life, that's how it looks. On basilar membrane, we have these hairs. They are inner hair cells and outer hair cells. Inner hair cells, there is quite a few of them, and they are connected through the auditory nerve, fibers of the auditory nerve, to the higher levels of hearing. Inner hair cells are also connected to the higher levels, except that most of them receive the signals and get the signals from the brain. So this is the most interesting thing, meaning that there is a means for something which is also very important and which has been discovered sometimes in the 18th century, which is called feedback. And let me give you a short story of the feedback, historical history. This was used, this is a windmill which was used for grinding the ground, the grains and so on. Problem with the windmill is that it works when the wind is blowing from here. And so if the wind changes the direction, you have to either walk out, if you can do it, you can turn things around, or you have to do something about it. So either you use many different mills in different positions, which is, of course, a little bit silly, but this is what we very often do in multi-style trading. We try to basically account for all possible situations which we may encounter, and then things are working better. Or you can rotate the mill. So, of course, the problem is that unless you are smart about it, you have to run out and somebody has to rotate the mill by hand. So there is a human in the loop, which we also use in speech recognition very often. It's a reinforcement learning, right? But people discovered something better, which is called feedback. Feedback works in the following way. They put a little bit what is it called? Wings or whatever it is. I don't know what the English name for that. On the back, and they make sure that if the wind comes in this direction, this thing is not. Let me put it here. This thing is not moving, and if the wind starts coming from somewhere else, this thing starts. The tail starts moving, and the whole thing is changing. So basically, on the situation coming from outside, you can turn the wind automatically. So the milliner can sleep happily, and mill was working even when the wind was changing a direction. And the reason I'm bringing it up is that it seems like the Mother Nature came up with a very similar solution. So in the form of these outer hair cells, basically inner hair cells are here, the signal goes in, inner hair cells send the signal up in the brain, but the outer hair cells then look at what's going out there and tries to maybe change, through the feedback, change the property of basilar membrane, sharpen the response to something what you want to hear. So very, very smart engineers design. Feedback is a good thing. Feedback makes the response much sharper, but maybe the feedback can be used also later for some other things. I will remind you the feedback. So feedback, important thing, discovered in the 18th century, but discovered by Mother Nature much, much, much earlier. And you have the first feedback which we are talking about is already in your inner ear. So just for you to remember, this is what's happening with what we talk about so far. This is a little picture which actually I very much like, so I decided to put it up. This is the ear, this is the eardrum, which keeps moving. And then the bones are moving, and bones are here. And then we straighten up the cochlea so that we can see this is the basilar membrane. And what we see, a low signal, high signal, even higher signal, different parts are active, right? And if you play something interesting, you see that what basilar membrane is doing is basically changing the one-dimensional sound into two-dimensional picture. In some ways, quite similar, a little bit analogous to what's happening on our retina when we are looking at things. Essentially, what we are using for analysis of speech, analysis of acoustic signals, is that, Okay. Oh, it's good. This is more important, actually. I think so. What you see here is that ear is changing one-dimensional signal into two-dimensional signal. So what we are working with is a two-dimensional signal where we have a time and we have a frequency components. Okay. Now, how do we get this information into the brain? On basilar membrane, there are these hair cells. The hairs end up in the hair cell, and as the hair bends, hair cell is likely to send out the impulse. And more the hair cell is moving, more impulses is sending, so we have a quite nice mechanism for coding intensity in each part of the basilar membrane. When there is no sound, there is a little bit of spontaneous activity, but then from the threshold, then it keeps increasing over about 30 decibels. But then when it starts saturating, other one maybe it's already happening. Okay, no, start saturating other part of the other hair cells may take over. So that's what we are getting for getting things. Threshold of firing is here. Threshold of firing is interesting because this is easy to measure, right? You put the wires in different nerves on different fibers on auditory nerve. And what you can prove is something what von Bekeshi saw, which is like depending on which auditory nerve you hit, the thresholds are different. So this is the auditory, this is a fiber which is connected to low frequencies. This is the fiber which is connected to higher frequencies. And you can see there is always what is called the best frequency. Essentially, the whole thing is working like a bank of bandpass filters. Let me use the opportunity also when we are talking about firing, about mentioning something which is very important in perception, which is this fact. So you get this tuning curve, which is called, this is where the hair cell is sensitive. And whenever you hit the tone within this hair cell, wherever it is inside, firing goes up. Obviously, more signal goes in as long as it is in a range where the hair cell is sensitive, it goes up. No surprise whatsoever. Nobody ever got a Nobel Prize for that. But what you could get a Nobel Prize, actually not in the hearing, but you see people got it in a vision. A very similar thing is happening in vision, is that if you hit the part which is not inside the region of the maximum sensitivity, but somewhere close, firing goes down. This is what is called, this is what is called lateral inhibition. This is the part where when you add the tone of a proper frequency and proper intensity, the firing goes down. So what you see here is what is called the lateral inhibition function. Sometimes we call it Mexican head function because it looks a little bit like Mexican head. And what Mexican head does for us is that if we get a signal which has a high spectral energy here and neighbored by low spectral energy, output is maximum. Basically, it's what is called matched filter for particular frequency pattern. And what is good about it, that if you put in white noise or something, which has components everywhere, thanks to the lateral inhibition, output is minimum. Basically, that makes our perceptual system less sensitive to things which are constant and more sensitive to particular patterns. And as I said, I'm using it as an example from the hearing, but Nobel Prize was indeed awarded for vision, because when people discovered this thing, that was a very surprising thing. Because that's something which people somehow don't expect. You give more energy and you get less output, because that makes sure that your system is not sensitive to things which are not changing, and it's sensitive to things which are changing. I hope that this is a little bit understood. So just to summarize what we talked about so far, place theory of hearing would be wonderful. We have this bank of bandpass filters, here it is, and we have a means for measuring how much energy is at each frequency. Essentially, it's like Fourier analysis. It would be great if we didn't remember that these filters are changing heavily with intensity, and for high intensities, for anything what is reasonable, like 60, 80 dB, basically the sharpness is gone. Those are the filters which are for low intensities, but for high intensity, pretty much their selectivity is gone. No matter which frequency you put in, this auditory neuron is going to be sensitive to that. Fortunately, there is another property of hearing, which is good to remember, which is what is called the synchrony. What happens is that as the sound comes, it's very likely that the firing will happen at the maximum of the sound. So here, and here, and here, up to 1 kilohertz, it's typically almost perfect synchrony with incoming sound. So brain has a very good means also to know what the frequency is, just simply by counting the spikes, looking at the periods in between spikes. For higher frequencies, up to 5 kilohertz, it doesn't happen at every maximum, but it always happens in a maximum. Basically, we say firing happens in a synchrony of the signal. And if we have there's no synchrony after about 5 kilohertz, but who cares about things about 5 kilohertz? You can basically understand speech perfectly okay, or even you can appreciate music, melodies reasonably well, as long as we are. If we know about the frequencies up to 5 kilohertz, how do we do it? If between 1 and 5 kilohertz, we have the whole set of fibers, and essentially if this one doesn't fire, this one fires, but the important thing is that that spike is always synchronized with the incoming signal, so at the end what we get out the string of the spikes, and that can tell the hearing what the frequency is. So place theory of hearing and rate theory of hearing. Place theory of hearing would be wonderful for us and engineers, because this is what we do with the Fourier transform. A rate theory of hearing is, of course, of interest to neuroscientists, because the whole communication in the human body and the sensory system, it happens in form of the spikes. So they like spikes much more then intensity of the spikes and that sort of thing. But what I wanted to remind you is that we talked only about a very small part of the hearing. This is about the periphery. The whole rest of the hearing goes, the signal goes through a number of stages and ends up in a brain, in auditory cortex, and that's where the things are happening. So we have to mention at least a little bit about what's happening at the higher levels. So what happens here, on the auditory nerve, firing is relatively slow, up to 1 kilohertz. But as we go higher and higher, and there is only about 50,000 fibers. If we go higher and higher, firing is slower and slower. Here we see a picture from the University of San Francisco. You see at the auditory cortex, maximum firing rate is of the order of tenths of the hertz as opposed to kilohertz on the auditory nerve. But higher levels are much more sensitive to more complex patterns. At the beginning, we are sensitive to simple things. As we go higher and higher, we are more and more sensitive to more complex patterns. Another important thing which we should realize and we should think about is that for some reason, whatever the ear does in terms of the signal, separating signal into different frequency channels, this whole thing is preserved all the way to the cortex. What is called the tonotopy is happening. So if it is 500 hertz, proper part of the basilar membrane is firing, but proper part of the auditory cortex is being tickled. So 500 hertz tickles this part of the cortex, while the other high frequencies tickle other part of the cortex. Why is that? Clearly, it must be somehow important. This division into different frequency channels must be important, because otherwise it wouldn't be preserved all the way to the cortex. It is. So once the signal is being separated in different frequency channels, all the way to the cortex is being preserved. So sometimes I try to say, if you think that ear is doing frequency analysis, yes, it does. But frequency analysis is not there to compute the spectrum, or even spectral envelope. Analysis is there to separate the components of the signal into different frequency channels so that each channel can be processed individually. Because that's what seems to be happening in the human hearing. How do we know? Neuroscientists came up with a number of techniques how to look at what's happening on the level of the cortex. The levels in between are not very well understood because they are not easy to access. But the ear, auditory nerve is easy, but the surface of the brain is also easy. All you have to do is to cut part of the skull, but it's okay. I mean, the doctors love to do it, and it doesn't hurt even. So what you can do is that you put a wire into nerve, neuron in your brain, and then you may play the sort of different complex signals, which this is time, this is a frequency. This is basically, this is a spectrogram of the stimulus, and you follow where the spike at auditory cortex happens, and then you remember the part of the signal just before the spike. And then you average everything, what happens just before the spike, say maybe 200 milliseconds, 300 milliseconds before the spike. And after averaging, whatever is garbage, whatever is noise, hopefully averages out. But whatever is systematic, whatever causes this spiking, actually pops up. This is called reverse correlation. It's one way of measuring properties of nonlinear systems for us engineers. This is being done in neuroscience quite a lot. People use all kinds of other signals, but basic principle is always the same. I measure, I look when the spike happens, I look at the signal which caused the spike happening, and you average a lot of these windows of the signal, and what you get what is called receptive field. So So this is an example of cortical receptive field for one neuron which has been measured. And what's happening here is that this neuron is sensitive to frequency, to signal burst at around 1 kilohertz, which starts sometime after the onset, and it lasts for about 300 milliseconds, and it's also followed by no signal here, and some activity up here at 6-7 kilohertz. So this is matched filter for the neuron in auditory brain, and it's telling us something about the properties of the hearing on higher levels of hearing. And if you look around the brain, those are different, several different auditory neurons measured here in auditory cortex. And what is interesting for that is that they are all relatively long. Each of them, these pictures are, each of them is 300 milliseconds long. You see that this maximum of activity are different at different frequencies. But main thing is that the neurons are different. We have about 100 million of them. So we have plenty of ways to look at the world if you're on a level of auditory cortical neurons. So it's almost like I would say we have 100 million channels which we can use to look at our speech. Interesting thing to think about, right? So this is pretty recent actually results, but neuroscientists love to do that, and I kind of love to look at it sometimes. We were interested in this temporal aspect, in this 300 milliseconds, so we took about 2,500 auditory neurons, and we computed the dominant component along the frequency, along the actually modulation frequency. This is time, frequency analysis of the time responses. What we observed indeed, that the whole thing is it follows a certain shape. Maximum of the sensitivity is somewhere between 1 and 8 hertz, or maybe 10 hertz. It's a bandpass filter, and this is how we are processing the signals. You see that we are not very sensitive to things which are not changing. I talked about it. This is partially because of these lateral inhibition components. We are not very sensitive to things which are changing very fast. Well, those are the ferrets. So ferrets are not very sensitive to frequencies which are higher than about 15 hertz. Most of the sensitivity is between maybe 2 and 8 or 1 and 12 hertz. Another interesting thing, this is I just thought I will share with you. This is the first time I'm talking about it, so if I'm a little bit confusing, excuse me, is that people measured the extent of the temporal buffers available in your brain. And they came up with a very ingenious technique where they would generate a signal from very short segments of the signal. You can cut out very short part of the speech or very short part of the music. And so you change the length of these segments. You do the long segments, you do the short segments, and then what you do is that you always have two streams with different orders. You see, here is always blue, here is also blue, but context is different. Here is orange, and here is purple, here is violet, and here is green. So you have a different context, and then you sort of look when the things start correlating on certain level. So you put the wire somewhere in the brain, and you say, if I put a wire right in the center of the auditory cortex, I will see at a certain point, the correlation will start. Initially, there is very little correlation when the window is very short, because you always have a chance that there will be. If the segment duration is very short, so the window is always longer than these short segments of the signal, but at a certain point, suddenly you start seeing the correlation reaching the maximum. This is at the point where you are hitting the length of the of these segments which you created, which is similar to or agrees with the length of the buffer in the brain. So anyways, we may need a little bit more time to spend on that, but what is important, what I want to show you is that what they came up with. What people came up with is if they measure the length of the temporal buffer in the center of auditory cortex here, then buffer is about 50, 60 milliseconds long. If they measure it a little bit out, suddenly the buffer starts getting longer, about 120 milliseconds. And further you go from the center of auditory cortex, Herschel's gyres, the longer buffer you get. Here on this level, you are getting about almost 200 milliseconds. Very ingenious technique, which we will need because when we get into the point where I will be talking about deep neural nets, you can use it also for your deep neural net. Because some of these techniques, maybe what I want to communicate to you, some of these techniques which come from the neuroscience actually can be very nicely used for analyzing our deep neural nets, which we always say we have no idea what they are doing. Actually, neuroscientists can give us quite nice tools sometimes because they deal with nonlinear systems and complex systems all the time. And sometimes, they are not engineers, but they are not dumb either. So anyways, so this is interesting. There is a way to measure how much auditory store we have in our brain based on the physiology of hearing. Another interesting thing is here. Here we started at the cochlea. Here we are in auditory cortex. We go through whole this sort of chain of the processing, but there is only about 10% of the connections which go from the ear to the cortex. 90% of the connections, the red ones, go from cortex, from brain to the ear. Why is that? I mean, we have more ability to control our sensor than sensor telling the brain about the information. So again, I mean, talking about the feedback, I mean, that's something to think about. And neuroscientists, actually, everybody tells you, yes, this is the case, but why is it? Well, there is some kind of feedback, but it would be good to know what it is. Physiology of hearing, okay, I have to speed up a little bit. Spectral domain, we know that we are separating spectral components into individual processing channels. Channel width is increasing with the frequency, and the spectral channels persist all the way to the auditory cortex. Good to remember. Temporal domain, we know about the temporal buffers from 50 milliseconds up to the 300 milliseconds. Overall, the best sensitivity to changes, to modulations of the signal is around 4 Hertz. But we are quite sensitive between 1 and 12 Hertz. Not very sensitive to things which are not changing, and not very sensitive on the level of auditory cortex for things which are changing faster than 15 Hertz. Very interesting. So the things that we are not sensitive to things which are not changing is wonderful, because we are not interested in things which are not changing, right? Things which are changing too fast, we are not interested either, because the things which we really care about in speech and music are the changes which are relatively slow. We will see it when it comes to speech production. So that was physiology, but we still have a psychophysics. Psychophysicists actually say, I don't give a damn what the hardware is doing. I want to know what it's doing. So what they do is they play the stimulus and they look at the response. And then from the response to the stimulus, they try to figure out what the whole system is doing. Initially, I thought that this is a royal way of understanding hearing, but now I sort of start get some appreciation for physiology too, I have to admit. So what is it that we can ask people? I mean, people can, of course, always like to tell you what they hear, but you have to ask them the right way in order to get a good answer. You can ask people if anything is there, thresholds. You can ask how much of that is there, scaling. You can ask, is one thing different from another? That's a discrimination. Or you can also ask what it is. Even with the detection, it's a very simple paradigm, which is like asking people if you hear something or not. You can actually learn quite a lot. First thing is that we discover very quickly, as we change the frequency, we discover that hearing is not very sensitive up to about 500 hertz. You know, the low frequencies we are not very sensitive to. Actually, the difference between 1 kilohertz and low frequencies is about 70 dB, quite a lot. We hear well here. So when we play with the thresholds, we can also discover that if we put in one signal, this one, of course, we hear because the target is above the level of the threshold. If we put the other signal, suddenly the whole threshold is changing. We get what is called mask threshold because masker is masking the target. And you can see, well, of course, I mean, if I have one loud sound, I will lose the percept of the other sound. Yes, but it also tells us a lot about the human hearing in general. It's actually very, very, very useful paradigm. Namely, this is an experiment which has been done in the 40s of last century at Bell Labs. You play the tone at a certain frequency, you notice what is the threshold, and then you add the noise around the tone, and you discover that you don't hear the tone, you have to make it stronger. So the threshold is changing. So you put in a different level of threshold. You add more noise, and again, I mean, you have to make the signal stronger for you to hear it. Again, I mean, this is nothing for to write home about, but what is interesting, when you add even more noise, suddenly the threshold doesn't change any longer. Basically, no matter how many more components you are adding, it doesn't matter. With respect to the detection of the tone within what is called the critical band, so what happens outside the critical band doesn't matter. Isn't that amazing property if you believe that we have these frequency channels which go all the way to the brain? Because it tells you if I have a noise over there, all I have to do is not to pay attention to channel which is noisy and pay attention to channel which is not noisy, because this noise doesn't disturb me. Frequency components within the critical band interact, but outside the critical band do not interact. This masking experiment tells it very clearly. And critical bands are about 100 hertz up to about 600 hertz, and then they increase linearly with the frequency. If we know why we're doing Mer's spectrum, now you know why. But the paradigm is a little bit different. Another thing is we talk a lot about the time here, right? In time, we have the very similar property. If we have a masker and a signal, so right, depending on a period between masker and the signal, if the period is short, there's a lot of masking. And as the period is increasing, after about 200 milliseconds, there is no effect any longer. And this is independent of the level of the masker. If the masker is strong, there is a lot of masking at the beginning, but again, after 200 milliseconds, once it flashes out of this buffer, basically it doesn't matter. So very similar paradigm. What happens outside the critical time interval doesn't affect the coding of the signal inside the critical interval. You know, it's a wonderful thing if you worry about things which change. I mean, because, you know, what happens now doesn't get influenced with the things which happened sufficiently before that. And on the first level, on the level of the hearing, about a couple of 100 milliseconds is the right number. You can ask how much things are there. Actually, this is something which is good to at least know. So you derive what is called psychometric functions. So you have a physical world where you measure intensity, frequency, how long the things are. But then it goes through this processing in our perceptual system. And in perceptual world, we are getting sensations which are different. Instead of intensity, we have loudness. Instead of frequency, we have pitch. Instead of length, we have duration. And so it's a very reasonable thing to ask how loudness depends on intensity. Answer is here. Of course, the less loud are more loud, but loudness depends on the cubic root of, approximately on the cubic root of the intensity. It's telling you if I want to hear something twice as loud, I have to put 10 more juice into my speakers, basically, because intensity has to be about 10 times larger in order for things to be twice as loud. Good thing to remember. Compressing function, root function. Equal loudness curve, again, a good thing to know about. I mean, this was the threshold here. But as long as the signals are getting stronger and stronger, these differences between low and high frequencies are decreasing a little bit. Speech is somewhere in the middle here. Still, there is some difference between things happening in the middle of the spectrum, and then there's a certain point where things are too loud that hearing gets hurt. Good thing to know about equal loudness curves too. This is a very interesting thing. This is used quite a lot. How high is the pitch? Pitch is how high the sound sounds. You play 1 kilohertz sound, and you ask people, can you make the sound that is twice as high? People don't say that 2 kilohertz, but they say 3.5 kilohertz. In order for them to make the sound sounding twice as high, you have to go much more than twice higher the frequency. So it follows what is called the Mel curve. This is the famous Mel which we are putting into our Mel analysis. You see that Mel and critical bands are not that different. We actually are probably we should be putting in a critical bands because those are the ones which actually tell us about frequency channels in the hearing. But if we use the Mel, the slightly different formula, but the curves are not all that different, this is what we are using, right? How long are the things? For this, I just picked up one example, which is also very interesting. So this is when we measure the length of the gap in the noise. Namely, if you are asking people, do you hear that there is a gap in the noise or not? If there is a noise and followed by the noise with the same intensity, gap is few milliseconds, 2-3 milliseconds. But you hear the gap the moment, then there is this hypothetical decay of the effect of the previous sound. And the moment the decay is large enough, the difference between the second part of the signal and the decaying part of the memory of the previous one is sufficiently enough, just noticeable in loudness, then you report that you hear the gap. So if you make the second signal much lower in intensity, the just perceived gap is much longer. And you can do it for a number of examples. I mean, so you start with a one fixed 65 decibel gap. This is a 2 millisecond when the second one is 65. But as you decrease the intensity of the second one, the just perceivable gap is increasing and increasing and increasing. And you do it for another situation where you change the intensity of the first one, and again the same thing. But you see, again, nonlinear phenomenon, and if you extend these lines, they end up somewhere around 200 milliseconds. Again, magic 200 milliseconds seems to be in the game. So how long are the sounds? It depends on how long they are in the first place. This is an example of a good pianist. Katja can tell us if this is the case or not. Because you have a quarters, you have a halves. This is a quarter, this is eighths, right? So you have eighths, which should be 66 milliseconds, and the quarter should be 132 milliseconds. But of course, the really good musician makes the 66 the quarters much shorter, because what you have to take into consideration is this decay of the effect, so that what you really are perceiving are these intervals here. So, and if you run the experiment and ask people how long are the things, you discover very quickly, you discover that very short segments, you can't tell at all. If something is shorter than about 160 milliseconds, everything sounds like 160 milliseconds, because you basically gets into the buffer and you can't tell the difference anymore. So very interesting stuff what people are learning in psychophysics. This one is also very interesting. You ask people, do you hear that thing is modulated or not? So modulation is that you change, this is amplitude modulation, but you can do similar experiment with frequency. Amplitude modulation, you change the amount of modulation. And you ask, can you hear that it's modulated or not? And you discover that most sensitive we are most sensitive to modulations around 3 to 4 hertz. Basically between 1 hertz and 10 hertz, we are the most sensitive, very much the same way as we have seen in the physiology of hearing. So perception of modulation, we will talk about it when it comes to speech, is very interesting. This is known since 1923, where laboratories were working on that. But this is something which I was hesitating that if I should show it or not, but I will. I mean, there is many examples which from the hearing. Forward masking, shifting, backward masking, gap detection, overestimation of the short stimuli, loudness decrement, just noticeable difference in frequency, which have a practically identical time constant. So it seems like the psychophysicists don't have much doubt that this buffer of a couple of 100 milliseconds, 200-300 milliseconds happens in hearing, and we will see that it may be useful when we start doing things like self-supervised training of our auditory models. Psychophysics of hearing, critical band spectral analysis is very important. Spectral components of the signal outside the critical band do not interact with components inside, meaning what is inside interacts, what is outside doesn't interact. Very similar thing happens in time. What is happening inside the critical interval interacts, what's happening outside the critical interval doesn't interact. So essentially we have this critical time frequency pattern, which is about several hundred milliseconds long, and critical band-wise, approximately critical band-wise, where the things are interacting outside that less so. Good. So this is all what I wanted to tell you about hearing. There is much more, because when I teach it for the whole semester, or actually a half semester, because when I teach hearing, I teach also image processing, vision processing with that. But it's about half semester. We did it in, wow, hour and a quarter. Good. So we have plenty of time for talking about speaking, because now we know about hearing. Oh, well, no, I mentioned things about the hearing. Now, if I'm right, we will see that people are speaking so that it follows the properties of hearing. And if I'm wrong, we will not see it. So how the speech happened? Again, I wasn't here, but I can imagine. We have a system which we use for breathing, eating, biting, kissing, all kinds of things basically which you can do with your system which we use for speaking. Suddenly people start thinking about, say, well, how about using it for speaking also? They might have observed other animals, they can create funny sounds, so they start learning how to make sounds of speaking.
When the sunlight strikes raindrops in the air, they act as a prism and form a rainbow. The rainbow is a division of white light into many beautiful colors. When the sunlight strikes as a prism and form a...
So what you can see, the way we speak, we mainly move the tongue. Of course, if you want to stop people speaking, you take the tongue out. That was favorite game for the Middle Ages, for the people in power, right? But then, so we move the tongue, we also move the lips, we move the jaw, and we also move something which is not seen very well, which is called velum. So there are maybe 4 degrees of freedom in the production of speech. And as we move this, then we are making these different shapes audible by exciting it from some source so that we can hear it. In the first place, people generate the different shapes of the vocal tract so that they can want to communicate, because people communicate by moving hands and everything, but they also communicate by moving auditory organs, but they figured out how to make it audible by exciting this vocal tract from vocal cords or by some other means. You get vocal cord vibration or air turbulence or pressure release, depending on type of the sound. There's a number of ways how you can excite the vocal tract. But what really matters, message is carried in changes of vocal tract shape, which modulate spectral components of speech. This is Homer Dudley, 1940, when he was a Bell Labs researcher who came up with the idea of vocoding, but he also came up with the idea of vocoding because he knew a lot about speech. Somehow in the process, we might have even forgotten what Homer Dudley was telling us, but I'll try to remind you. It's the modulations of the source which carries the message. And I have a little example of that because that's what Srinam Ganapati, my former student, came up with that. So this is a speech.
They are both trend-following methods.
In an ideological argument, the participants tend to thump the table.
So this is a male and female speech. If we separate the modulating component, so essentially if we modulate the white noise by the contributions from the vocal tract, this is what we get.
They are both trend-following methods.
In an ideological argument, the participants tend to thump the table.
Clearly, the message is there, right? It sounds it's like whispered because it's excited differently, but it's there. If you listen for the source, there is some prosody there. There is some prosody there. You also can tell that it's a male or female because a male has a lower fundamental than a female, but definitely message is.
They are both trend-following methods.
In an ideological argument, the participants tend to thump the table.
So in that way, I want to give the credit to Homer Dudley, and I want to remind that to ourselves that that's what matters. And I think I have a little bit of extra time, so I decided I go through a little bit of a speech production. I will mention something from which speech production people like to talk about, which is nomograms. Nomograms start in following way. First thing is we want to know tiny little bit about acoustics and acoustic resonances. So how the speech is being transmitted is by changes in acoustic pressure. There are parts of low pressure, high pressure, low pressure, high pressure. If we excite the things with a sinusoid, it's a sinusoidal tone. This is what is happening in the air. If such a wave hits the wall, that at this point you are guaranteed that the pressure is maximum and at the wall and minimum at somewhere in the opening. Imagine that there is a tube. So we can actually measure at which frequency. I should have made a tube here. Let me go here. Yeah, that might be the right thing. So it is in the tube. We know for sure that the pressure is the minimum at the opening and maximum at the closing, right? And that happens for a number of frequencies. This is the lowest frequency, quarter wave of the lowest frequency. This is a 3/4 of the wave of the lowest frequency, 5/4 of the wave of the lower frequency. So these are what we call speech formants of speech. This is where vocal tract, which is entirely open, resonates. It's 500 hertz, 1500 hertz, 2500, 3500, 4500, if the length of the tube is 17 centimeters, which is typical for males. I don't know why they talk about males, not about the females, but that's what textbooks are about. Now, we have a principle which we can follow to figure out what happens if we start putting obstruction somewhere, using the lips or using the tongue or something. So if you put the obstruction at the point of minimum acoustic pressure, this mode will go down. So if we put the obstruction at the beginning, all the frequencies will go down because all the modes have a minimum at the opening. So we know what the frequencies of formants will do if we start closing the lips. All the formants will go down. Every phonetician tells you about it. But if you start doing different things, that you start putting obstruction here, some of the modes will go up and some of them will go down because there is a different distribution of the pressure for the second formant. And go further, 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 and you can see as we put the constriction at different points, formants are changing very differently. Sometimes they get very close, sometimes they go very far. So at the end, what we get what is called a nomogram. Those are the sensitivity curves, and it tells you where you should put the constriction if you want to influence the first formant or second formant or third formant the most. This is what you get if you study speech production. What I want to talk about, namely, the reason I'm showing it to you is that all frequencies, changes happening at all frequencies of auditory spectrum. Anytime I do something with my vocal tract, the whole frequencies throughout the whole spectrum is changing. So in that way, I'm claiming that I have a very convenient way to distribute the information about the vocal tract shape into different frequencies. If you think about it. It's pretty complex, but if you want to study it carefully, people tell you where maybe that I'm being a little bit vague about it, but the truth is that I just showed you if I change something in the vocal tract, all frequencies of the spectrum are changing. So information about the shape of the vocal tract is at all frequencies. Gross shapes, not surprisingly, are at low frequencies. More details are at higher frequencies, but it's okay. So what I can see here, what's happening is I have a motor control when I'm producing a speech, and I influence my 4 critical elements, tongue, lips, jaw, velum, and whole vocal tract shape is changing the shape. That I can't help, because if I move the tongue, I cannot just move the one component. Everything is changing. So I put information at all frequencies. I did a redundant coding of the message into different frequencies. Redundancies are good for those of you who know a little bit about information theory, because that allows us that maybe we can figure out what's going on even when we destroy part of the signal. And we'll get into that. So people learn, in my mind, I just want to support my hypothesis. Since people knew that they have a frequency selective hearing, they said that would be very convenient to put a message in such a way that it spreads at all frequencies, because I know that my frequency selective hearing can pick up the appropriate components and maybe put together things. More components are not corrupted, better I can do it. But if half of the components are screwed up, as we will see, it's not a tragedy, because the coding is redundant in frequency. So any change of the tract shape is reflected at all frequencies of the speech spectrum, and so that information about linguistic message is coded redundantly at all frequencies. And hearing is frequency selective, and can pick up this distributed information elements and put it together in the brain so that they know what's going on outside. And if half of it gets corrupted, it's not a tragedy, because the another half can probably still provide enough information that we can figure out what's going on, as we will see. I'll get into it later. Another thing is that things are not happening very fast in a hearing, because we cannot move things very fast. I mean, dominant frequency appears to be somewhere around 5 hertz. You know, you cannot move, you cannot keep moving vocal tract very fast. So if I want to say 3 sounds, what comes out, because of what is called the sluggishness, we call it co-articulation, comes out this basically smeared things, like out of focus. So the red one is mixed with the blue, and blue is mixed with the green, and we even know how much co-articulation approximately people do. This is what Katya Yegorova did for me as a class project at the time. So she was actually looking into cumulative differences between this measurement in frequency and then measurements which are in certain distance from the center of the phoneme. And she did it for a lot of speech, for timid, and what she discovered was, of course, if the things are very close, if these things are very close, things are very similar, right? But as you go further and further, things are more and more different. But after certain lengths, about 200, 250 milliseconds, things are not different anymore, because we are already guaranteed we are out of this co-articulation pattern. So Katya knows what is the extent of, approximately extent of co-articulation. And if we look at modulation frequency of speech, because we talk about modulations, we can do it. How will we do it? We pick up one frequency component, take a derivative to get rid of this natural minus 6 dB decay. And so we get a certain signal, which is a function of time, which tells me how the spectrum is, how the signal is modulated at this frequency. So I measure the modulation frequencies, and I look how this modulation frequency, not me, but people at the University of Maryland did, look at different modulation frequencies for different materials, sentences, conversations, interviews, audiobooks. All of them have a maximum around 4 hertz, not many components below 1 hertz, not many components above 16 hertz. Same thing is for different languages, American English, Mandarin Chinese, French. Essentially, people are speaking in such a way that it fits into expected sensitivity of human hearing to modulations, and they cannot do anything else. I was giving this talk to some phoneticians, and they say, what did you expect? Everybody speaks the same. I said, well, you know, it's very interesting, and it's interesting to see it. So I think that this work was actually very nice. Took about 2 years to get it published, as far as I know, because people didn't believe the results are so good. But due to the sluggishness of vocal organs, information about the message is distributed in time. But hearing has a temporal buffer, which collects this information which is distributed in time. And since whatever is happening in the buffer is available for your processing, so you process the things together so that you can figure out what people try to say in the first place. So co-articulation is good and not bad. For the longest time, we'll get into it when it comes to technology, but for the longest time, co-articulation was considered far the worst thing which happens to speech engineers who want to recognize speech. Till now, this is probably one of the best things, because that allows us to spread information in time, so that we'll get to, so that some disturbances happen, and we can figure out what's going on. So how do we speak? In spectral domain, acoustics of the human vocal tract makes the information about tract shape to be distributed at all frequencies of speech spectrum. So message is present at all frequencies of speech spectrum in different ways, but turns out that we can figure out how to put it together even when a part of it is being screwed up. In time domain, sluggishness of vocal tract makes the information about the tract shape to be distributed in time over the co-articulation patterns, at least about 200–300 milliseconds. And that actually is very useful, and those of us who now train the wave-to-X and that sort of things turn out may like it, because actually this is what we, as we talked yesterday briefly, this is what we talk about. So let me now take the liberty to state my hypothesis, because now we know a little bit about hearing, physiology, and psychophysics, and we know a little bit about speech. So now let's talk about the human speech communication. Hypothetically, because I mean, it still obviously needs a lot of support, more support than what I can provide here. In production, every change in the tract shape shows at all frequencies of speech spectrum. In perception, hearing is frequency selective, can separate information into different frequency channels and put it together. I should have put that, right? Tract shape doesn't happen very fast. Hearing has also significant inertia, which turns out to be very similar to inertia of production. So it can keep the information in a buffer for about several hundred milliseconds and can figure out what is happening in this co-articulation pattern. Here we have it. So here are the sequence of speech sounds which we want to produce. First thing is there is inertia. So the things happen, get spread in time. Then it goes into redundancies in the frequency. And so things happen at all frequencies. So speech signal carries information in different frequencies and over significant or quite noticeable segments of speech about a quarter second. So now, we talk about speech production. We should look at the speech itself. Because now, if I'm telling you what I'm right, that I'm right, if I want to support my idea, I have to look at the speech and I have to see if I see it there. It turns out, actually, I have a great respect for speech. Speech data, thanks to Fred Jelinek, whose name is on the workshop. Thanks to Fred, I really learned to appreciate the data itself. If the speech evolves to be heard, properties of hearing must be imprinted on speech. So I have to be able to look at the signals and see if I see these properties of hearing there. But what I see is, I will see the properties of hearing which are relevant to decoding of speech. Not everything what hearing can do is relevant to decoding of speech. Hearing needs to do many, many other things besides listening to other people talking, right? So if I see it in a signal, then I know this is a property I may need. And of course, not surprisingly, those would be the properties I already mentioned. But there's no guarantee that the other properties may be also important. But if I don't see it in a signal, probably it's not all that important. There is no data like more data. This is something which we always try to remember ourselves. Bob Mercer mentioned that. Bob Mercer is certainly no dummy. He was one of the richest person I ever met in my life. And more data is better than more thinking. That's what Fred reminded me that Eric Brill was saying. Actually, I like it very much. You know, that helps us too. I mean, sometimes thinking is painful, right? But as long as we are processing the data, we are working. Joking. But But that's what people sometimes say. Basically, collecting the data and making the databases and this sort of thing is very important part of our discipline. Sanjeev can guarantee that with the LibreSpeech and all kinds of things. It's probably LibreSpeech probably got more references than any other single paper in speech, I believe, because everybody needs good data, right? In the old days, this is how I grew up. We should learn from human hearing, and we should put it in the speech. This is all in form of the iPhone, right? So that was the old, and it's still true. I mean, old wisdom, but more reliable knowledge we put in the system, less we need to learn. That's true in general in lives. More we know, less we need to learn. However, I learned to appreciate the other way around too. Learning from the data is not just for machines anymore. Speech is a very valuable source to waste it only on training of machines. Speech is so valuable that we should learn from it. I don't know how strongly I should say that. So we should be able to look at our machines and learn about, which are trained a lot of speech, and learn about speech. So, and when we learn, then we learn about the human beings, and of course, then we know better about human beings, and we can put even more into future machines. So if you go this way, is the right way to go. But I will be mainly focusing, so far I focus on this. I told you about what we know about the human hearing. Now I will be talking about how to get more knowledge out of speech signal. Oh, by the way, I didn't want to make a break. If somebody needs to go and take a break, please maybe keep the door open. Just walk out and come back, and I will stop if I lose all my voice, and then I will go and drink a little bit more water or something and talk more. So there will be no break. I will be talking, and when we are over, then we go for lunch, okay? So talking about speech. First question is, where is the information in speech? So we can ask technique which is called mutual information. We can ask how well some features predict the labels about the speech sounds. And for this we will need several things to do. We will need a histogram of spectral values at given frequency from as large database as we possibly can get. We may want to quantize our data because mutual information like the histograms is, well, not necessarily, but that's what we did. So we approximate the distribution by histograms. Then we need the histogram of labels from the whole database, and then we need the joint probability of the labels and the quantized features. When it comes measuring the information in frequency domain, this proves my point. Information about speech is at all frequencies of speech spectrum. Maybe slightly different amounts. Most information is around 5 bars, and that at the higher frequencies. But this is what I told you, and this is what we see in the data during studies of mutual information. So if the information is at all frequencies, then I should be able to find some experiments which support it. And I found experiments which were carried out at laboratories for a very long time, since 1925 until 1940s or something, or maybe 45. Where they were doing things where they were asking people how well they can recognize speech sounds in presence of the noise, in presence of the different frequency limits, putting it through speech through filters, and at the end, the conclusion was following. There seemed to be about 20 frequency bands in the speech spectrum. They were looking at the spectrum up to 7 kilohertz at the time. In these frequency bands, here we have the bands. Those are cut-off frequencies. They are non-equally distributed in frequency, but they were set up in such a way that each of them carries very similar amount of information. What is the most interesting? Contribution of each band is dependent only on signal-to-noise ratio in this band, because these bands were set up so that for clean speech, each band carries equal amount of information as measured. If the signal is better than, if signal-to-noise ratio is better than 30 decibels, this band is perfect. If the signal-to-noise ratio is worse than 0, forget it, don't use it. Carries no information whatsoever. Each frequency band yields certain error rate. To get the final error rate, you should take probabilities of errors at all frequencies and multiply them to get a final error rate. What it says, that bands which have a lowest error rate dominate the product because all the probabilities are less than 1, right? So the best bands dominate the final result. Bands which have a probability error close to 1 contribute almost nothing because in product, basically, it doesn't contribute anything. Any 10 bands is sufficient for 70% correct recognition of nonsense syllabi. Any 10 bands out of 20, if the signal is clean, you can recognize about this nonsense syllabi with about 70% correctness. That means that if you add all the top-down knowledge about the language and everything, that allows for almost perfect communication. So that means that you can take the lower half of the spectrum and you can still communicate perfectly okay. You can take the opposite, forget about the one which you had before, and take the half part of the spectrum, and again, you get 70% correct, perfect, almost perfect situation for communication. Or you can come with all kinds of combination of bands, and again, you can communicate still perfectly okay. So this is, if that doesn't blow your mind, as it blows mine, I think it's, because that is almost suggestion how we should build the speech recognizers. So we shouldn't be ever looking at all frequencies. We should be looking at these individual frequency bands as suggested by what we know about properties of hearing. And then at the end, put things together and so that we get as good result as possible. We'll get into it when we come to speech recognition. So speech analysis is very important if we take a speech signal and say nothing about speech signal except that ask, take a DNN-based ASR. This is from Sarah, her experiment. They put buffers in the front of the deep neural net. And they said, can you also modify the properties, impulse responsive of the filters which are in these buffers, and tell us what kind of filters you will get. These filters actually are from Johns Hopkins, but they got very similar result. What you get very clearly that you are getting bandpass filters in front of your classifier. So if something doesn't convince you that spectral analysis and separating signals into different frequency channels is important, this should. Number of people basically repeated this experiment in various disguises, but still they are getting the same thing. So frequency analysis is very important. Set of bandpass filters is important. Nothing was biased in putting bandpass filters here, but at the end, what you got is a set of bandpass filters in front of your deep neural net. So let's look into frequency. And we use a very ancient technique because this is something which allows us to do the analysis carefully. It's a linear discriminant analysis. Answer will be linear, so it can be interpreted in terms of weights and that sort of things. Linear discriminant analysis takes the big bag of vectors with the labels and tries to rotate the space which is described by this big bag of vectors in such a way that you preserve most of the discriminability, maybe in smaller amount of dimensions. So you take the spectrum and you take the spectra with different labels. So this comes from the phoneme yo. This is the spectrum of yo. And you do it for all the big database. So you get what a linear discriminant analysis likes, which is vectors, spectral vectors, with the labels. And you can do the discriminant analysis. What comes out, it comes discriminant matrix. And you can look at a few discriminant vectors which are ordered in order of the eigenvalues. So the first ones are the most important. This one, 29% of discriminability, 27% of discriminability. Those are the vectors. And if you ask Lukáš how to get the weights out of that, he tells you. This is his pre-PhD work. He may not remember that anymore, but I do. So these are the weights which are suggested by Lukáš's linear discriminant analysis of the spectra. And if it reminds you of Mer's spectrum, the similarity is not accidental, right? You get narrow bands here, narrow bands here. Let's see, how do I get here? Narrow bands here, broad bands here. So no surprise, we can now say with certain confidence, spectral selectivity of hearing is very important in speech recognition. It's good that people start sometimes the recognition with the waveforms because first step is anyways spectral analysis. At least we know it is very important. Pretty much we should stick into critical bands. They are reasonably well established in hearing because it's telling us the important things. What's happening inside the critical band should be processed together. And existence of these critical bands allow the independent processing of individual frequency components, spectral components. Mel spectrum, just for those of you who are brand new in speech recognition, here we come. The way we do it, engineers already figure out ways how to do things simply. Take a Fourier transform, take the Lukáš's weighting, right, the Mel scale filter bank, take a logarithm because in old days we believe that Gaussianizing things is important. Now probably not anymore. I don't know why people still take a logarithm. If you have nothing better to do, try to take some roots or something. Maybe you will get a little bit better results. I don't know. We don't need the logarithms anymore because we don't need the Gaussian distributions anymore. And in Mer's Capstrom, I should say Capstrom, we used to project the result on a cosine basis because we believed that we want to decorrelate the features. Forget all about it because neural nets don't care. But this is still, so now people typically use it on a level here, Mer's spectrum. They don't bother with cosine basis because cosine basis do damage to your spectrum because first you divide the things into different frequency components, and then you put it all together through projecting it on a cosine basis. That's a dumb thing to do. So no psychophysicist would advise you to do that. But we did it for a long time, and that's why we worried so much about all kinds of noises, which we maybe don't worry about all that much. Spectrum, divide it, weight it, get critical band spectrum. I take a liberty that now people use 80 filters, which at the beginning makes no sense whatsoever because they are just so narrow that they have nothing to do with the critical bands. I think that these filters are maybe a little bit better, but I'm not pushing it on anybody. Just to say, but I think keeping the constant bandwidth would be more along the lines of what I would suggest, but maybe some asymmetries which we see in auditory filters are also not so bad. Vijay Pedinti a long time ago was optimizing filters. That's what he discovered. If we do the spectral analysis right, we keep only the low resolution spectrum. What does for us is that different species of human beings, like males and females, start looking a little bit more similar. That's interesting. I just wanted to show it. So this is a good thing to do. So that much for the spectrum. I mean, it's I think 80 filters. Why we use it? Because I think that we need many very large dimensionality for our following classification. But people use it. I don't know if it is necessary or not. I would suggest 20 filters would be just fine. But anyways. So, time. Where is information in time? Again, the same thing. We do the mutual information, so we measured all these histograms, which I told you, but this time we will be looking not at different frequency components, but at different temporal components in every frequency band. What we will discover, that the signal is spread over about 160 milliseconds. This is from one component. If we measure second component, things are getting broader. Second component basically goes more into where there is less information in the first one, obviously. So it's getting broader and broader. So this is where the information is in time, according to mutual information, which asks where the information about the labels is in the time frequency plane. Linear discriminant analysis can be also applied in time, except instead of taking vectors as a spectral vectors, you take a temporal vectors, meaning like this is evolution of the spectral energy at a given frequency as a function of time. But again, to LDA, it's nothing but a vector and has a labels. So what you can do is that you can ask yourself, what is the best way to discriminate between different temporal trajectories? And here is the answer. You remember the lateral inhibitions, right? Those are the impulse responses. These are the frequency responses. You remember the human sensitivity of human hearing, maximum in around 4 Hertz, high between 1 and 10 Hertz. These are the higher discriminants, but pretty much follow a very similar thing. So essentially, we are getting still the same message. No matter how we look at the speech, no matter how we look at the signal, we're still getting the same message, which is like, in frequency, you should do the spectral analysis, maybe with the filters which are getting broader and broader, towards higher frequencies. In time, you should be looking at least over 200-300 milliseconds. If you don't, you're robbing yourself of information. You're chopping it into little pieces, then it's difficult to put it together. This is what I think. Those are the filters which I got with Honza Peshan here at Brno, so they are not all that different. You see, again, those are these modulation filters, maxima around 1 Hertz. This one is a really very nice one, right? Between 1 and 10 Hertz, 1-pass filter. This is what I got from my student Samik Sadhu quite recently, ICAS 2023. He looked at the mutual information directly in a modulation domain. And what he got again a filter like this, or a sensitivity like this. This is 1 Hertz, this is 10 Hertz, right? This is at 4 Hertz, maximum of the maximum information at 4 Hertz. So I only hope that they don't do it to keep me happy, students, because they still keeps coming with the same answer, which is like sensitivity of human hearing is highest around 4 Hertz. Transfer function of auditory cortex of ferrets peaks there. That's what we get. And when we and this modulation domain is telling us something about properties of the speech in time domain. So now we can go back into this sluggishness of the vocal organs. I promise you that I show you also what that can be good for. It can be good for co-articulation. Co-articulation may be our friend. Those are the old experiments, 1976, when Winifred Strange came up with this paper. People also were sort of saying, I can't believe it. She looked at how accurately you can get recognized 9 vowels in isolation, 70%, and how well you can get it when they are co-articulated, when you present them in a PEEP syllabi, 91% accuracy. So in isolation, we are not very good in recognizing vowels. If you present them in a proper context with the co-articulation into neighboring stops, you get much better. Oops. And she continued on that. This is also very interesting. She recognized the vowels in the syllabi dat, dut, det. And so it was German speech. She's German, right? I mean, so what she got when she put the whole syllable, got 100% accuracy. If she cut only out the vowel, she got 80% accuracy. But if she only kept the vowel, she was getting 85% accuracy. But if she cut the vowel out and only kept the co-articulated consonants, she got 90% accuracy. So if this is not convincing about the usefulness of spectral dynamics and about the co-articulation and about the good idea which Mother Nature had when she was constructed speech, so that it is the human hearing, I don't know what. Another one, actually, yeah, okay. If you interrupt the speech, this is where the inertia of the speech, of the hearing comes also. Interrupt speech so that you play the speech, noise, speech, noise, speech, noise. The best situation is if you keep 10 milliseconds of speech, 100 milliseconds of speech, they leave the 100 milliseconds of no speech. This is like pretty much like how you train your. It's related to how we train our wave-to-wake, right? So you basically mask part of the speech by noise, speech, noise. If it is with the right rhythm, 200 hertz segments of the 100 millisecond speech, 100 millisecond of noise, even in a 18 dB signal to noise ratio, you get about 80% speech accurate. Because as long as you keep enough of speech in this buffer, at least 50%, you seem to be getting enough in order to recognize. So if our recognizers work like that, wouldn't that be nice? You know, that tells you something about the robustness of human speech perception. But now we also know why it is so robust, because it has these buffers, and as long as the whole combination of speech and non-speech fits into a buffer, you're fine. Phoneme restoration, another experiment I thought I'll mention. This is very well known. 1970, Richard Warren cut out part of the word legislation, replaced it by coughing. People hear the word perfectly okay, and they cannot tell where the cough happened. They knew that there was a coughing in the speech, but they didn't know where it was, and they had no problem with restoring the part which was missing. And he observed that when it comes to whole sentences, interruption can be as long as 250 milliseconds. People can still restore the speech. Again, because of this inertia. When we suppress the slow frequency changing components. That's what suggests all this work on modulation frequencies. We'll get a very interesting thing, which is like that what you get, oops, I don't know why. That if you take the speech which has been filtered through linear filter, the spectrum looks very, very different. But since the distortion was coming fixed over a certain length of time, then spectrograms, after we filter out these non-changing components, remain to look the same. And actually, I don't know why I don't hear the sound here, don't have a sound here, but no, it's gone. Anyways, so these things are happening in time and in frequency. When it comes to time frequency patterns, we can also do our favorite place, which is called linear discriminant analysis. And now we will do this discriminant analysis on two-dimensional patterns. And again, what we get a two-dimensional discriminants, but these discriminants this time start looking kind of similar to things which we have seen on auditory cortex. You see, so these are different patterns. Some of them are sensitive to high frequencies. Some of them are sensitive to low frequencies. Some of them are sensitive to the appropriate combination of components throughout the whole frequency spectrum. Some of them are also sensitive to some temporal distributions. So this is something which we have been looking for a little bit. We were looking at this with Luca Ondel also using a two-dimensional patterns in front of the deep neural net and optimizing neural nets together with this two-dimensional buffers. This is what we were getting out. Turn out to be, again, quantitatively, qualitatively, it's very similar to what we have seen, or we are seeing on auditory spectrum, on a cortical receptive fields of the mammals. We had also the technique, which was at a certain point used quite a bit. Peter Fosek came up with that, and we sold it at the time to people at Aachen. They liked it for a while. So those were our emulations of the two-dimensional patterns, and it worked reasonably well. So that allows me at least to say what we have seen in speech signal. So data-guided processing, such as critical band analysis, temporal data-guided processing, such as the temporal domain, at least 200-300 millisecond signal spans, and we should be enhancing modulations between 2 and 12 hertz. Perceptual experiments, such as existence of articulatory bands, where probability of error in each band is multiply in deriving the final error after the processing in the bands. Bands which are very noisy, with SNR worse than 0 dB, are worthless. Bands which are have at least 30 dB, signal-to-noise ratio are perfect. And what we see when we look at data-guided processing, we seem to be seeing spectral temporal filters, which indicate cortical light processing, where multiple combinations of spectral and temporal elements in a critical time frequency intervals of speech. So I have a certain feeling that maybe we have some support for the hypothesis that human speech evolved to fit properties of human hearing, what linguists were telling us, Jacobson and Walk. We speak in order to be heard and need to be heard in order to be understood. information about speech sounds is distributed in frequency and collected by multiple frequency channels, and in time, it's collected by multiple temporal buffers of hearing. So, if this is the way we are producing speech, when the speech goes out, it gets corrupted, but it's not a big tragedy, because this corrupted time frequency pattern of speech goes into our hearing system, where we have these temporal buffers. We have millions of these channels, so we don't have to be very, very stingy about it. But we know that they are couple of hundred milliseconds, at least couple of hundred milliseconds long, probably longer. We get information in individual frequency streams. It's of course corrupted comparing to what we're getting out here. But if we are smart about it and we do the correct fusion of multiple streams, we may be able to get what people are trying to tell us. So this is of course cartoon. I wish it was, I had as much evidence as possible. I could support this idea, but this is the way I feel about speech, about human speech, based on what I'm seeing in a way speech is being produced, speech is being perceived, and speech looks like. So I have some confidence to talk about some speech engineering, and this, I hope, will take another 10, 15 minutes, and then we can go for lunch. Again, more knowledge we hardwire, less machine needs to learn. Frederick was reminding us, airplanes do not flap wings, but they do have rings. So something might be useful, what we see in human hearing. But he also says, well, you know, whatever knowledge you are using should be supported by the data, and I hope that this is what we are doing. So I think the temporal aspects of speech are very relevant. It has been largely ignored. Part of it, I believe, it is because of the way we are doing speech analysis for past 50 or 70 years. Because Homer Derley was telling us, message is carried in changes in vocal tract shape, which modulate spectral components of speech. And if we want to see modulations in different frequency bands, we need to look over long segments of spectral envelopes in frequency bands. So what we are doing until now, I'm not sure that this is correct. We should maybe go back to human hearing. When human hearing takes the signal and separates it into different frequency channels as a function of time over significant lengths of time. And so we should be coming with analysis which looks like this. Fortunately, we do have analysis, a technique like that, and I will tell you a little bit about it. And we take the signal and we put it into different frequency bands, and then we derive the features directly from different frequency bands over certain lengths of time. It's called a frequency domain linear prediction. I give a credit to Marius Attineos and then Ellis, though it should go even more to people at Rhode Island who were first coming with this technique. But we picked up on that. Marius was my postdoc for a while in Switzerland. So we worked on it quite a bit. There is a technique which knows how to approximate the Hilbert envelope of the signal in time. The approximation by all-point model is convenient because it allows you to select order of the model, so the amount of detail which you want to keep in. Features do carry information about the rate of change in logarithmic envelope. That is about the modulation spectrum. Modulation spectrum can be directly computed from these frequency domain linear predictors through the recursion, no Fourier transform needed. And you can also do some convenient processing of the speech spectrum, speech in this domain. So how it works, instead of doing what we used to do, you have a speech signal, and you cut the time domain window, and after pre-processing, find the autoregressive model, find the all-pole spectrum, and find the approximation to short-term spectrum. If you do this in a Fourier transform domain or cosine domain, depends, so there are two dialects of this frequency domain linear prediction. You get into frequency domain instead of in time domain. But if you are in a frequency domain, you can pick up appropriate frequency band by windowing. So windowing this time doesn't limit your analysis in time, but limits your analysis in frequency. This may represent maybe 1 second of speech. And so this part of the Fourier transform tells you about low frequencies, and this part of the Fourier transform tells you about high frequencies. You approximate it by all-pole model, and what you get a spectrum, again, spectrogram, except the spectrogram is in that case computed from these components in time. Typically what we do is that, that's what Vijay came up with, that these are the optimal filters which work the best. They are asymmetric. So these are the weightings which are being applied on Fourier transform. So higher cutup is much sharper than lower cutup. Lower cutup, this comes from the properties of masking. If you study hearing a little bit more carefully, you would appreciate why it is that way. I'm sorry. So what you get out, you go into speech. You may pick up, first you pick up the parts of the speech which you want to work with, maybe, but in this case, you may be looking at about 1, 2, 3 seconds, or maybe if you listen to Hynek, maybe shorter, 300 milliseconds or something. Oops, sorry. Somehow if I use it, if I move it too much, it starts jumping. So I have to be very careful. Oh, yeah. So in each cochlear subband, I get the approximation of all-pole model. I get a modulation spectrum. Once I have a modulation spectrum, I can, of course, compute the temporal trajectory of the spectral energy in the appropriate band. So I get FDLP spectrograms, and if I want a longer segment, I can just concatenate it I get a time frequency representation of speech. So this is the old way of doing things, essentially fitting what we have. So start getting something which is similar to Mel spectrum, then all what remains for us to show that it works at least as well as modulation spectrum, or maybe better. But this is something which we were getting with Samik. So you can see that we get pretty much the same results, maybe a little bit better, from FDLP on Wall Street Journal. And also in reverberations, Samik was seeing some advantages of the technique. And what I think about is more like sort of just giving some leads to people who are curious if things cannot be done a little bit differently, which is like once we have these results describing relatively long segments of the speech in terms of the modulation spectra. So we are getting one result every couple of, maybe 4 times a second or something. So what we are thinking about is there isn't some way to put results directly from FDLP directly into large language model, which actually likes the low rate of change, because typically what we are starting, we start with 100 hertz, then we downsample it into 50 hertz, then we try downsample it in 25 hertz, and here we are already getting results in a rate of 4 hertz. So I wonder if there wouldn't be some way of interfacing FDLP directly into GPT. This is something which is dear to my heart. I think that we should be doing processing in individual frequency bands and do information fusion after we do as much processing as possible before we start getting sequences of words. So the streams may be enhancing different parts of the spectrum, different parts of different modulations or something. So this is the result which Samik was getting when we were, when he divided processing into different frequency bands and did processing of first band, second band, third band, and then he trained the fusion with the dropouts. There was a similar dropout which people now use in spec argument. And and he was, getting actually reasonably good results. Where he did nothing, he had 12.6% error on Aurora noisy data. When we went to the substreams, he got improvement, about 10% relative. And when he starts dropping the streams, he got yet another 10% of improvement. So we were very happy, and then we were also happy to see that Google later got very nice technique for training a neural net called SpecLog, which basically verified what Samik was seeing, that dropping out some frequency bands in the training of the recognizer actually is not bad, builds quite a bit of robustness. But of course, there is this sparsity of auditory cortex, and we shouldn't be forgetting about that. Just to remind you, we start with 50,000 fibers on auditory nerve, and we end up with 100 million of cortical neurons, out of which 5 million may be active. So there is a huge expansion of the number of possible pictures of the signal available in the brain. And there are all these top-down feedback connections. So why is that there? I mean, so why the Mother Nature provided us with a system like that? So it might be that when we are processing acoustic signals such as speech, we have a means for modifying the property of the system so that we can do a better job. And so that we can get optimal information. Of course, what is optimal? Optimal for human beings is to get the information through. So we may not exactly know how to look if the result is optimal, but this is something which we want to work on. Because if we have some performance monitoring technique at the output of the fusion, then we may be able to put it into feedback and change the streams which are being used to get a better result. And this is actually, in some ways, something which we've been doing. So we have several techniques for doing that. One is related to something which I already talked about, which is like that if you look at if you compute what is called a M measure, which is looking at the difference between current vector and vector which is a certain distance of time, then for clean data, we've saturated higher level than for noisy data. So looking at the ratio between what's happening here and what's happening here tells us something about the quality of the signal. We use this measure quite a little bit. The other one is that we sort of say we get the best result if the recognizer is trained on its own training data. And Alex can verify it. He ran, Alex, tell me if I'm wrong, but he ran a library speech on training data of library speech on trained library speech trained on its training data, and he got 0.9 error, right? So you can see the recognizer works quite well. No? Anyways, you do get a good result if you run your test data through the trained recognizer. Not if you run your training data through the recognizer on which it was trained. So if you get a good result for that, we may be able to take something out of the trained recognizer applied to its training data and derive the model of something, and then fit this model of something while we are running recognizer on a test data. And if the fit is good, we may feel that our result is reasonable. Right? This is what Nima Mesgarani tried a long time ago in 2011. He used a very simple thing, which we computed out the product of the output from the phoneme recognizer on the training data and on the test data, and then he compared the two, measured the distance between these cumulative outer products, and that was one technique which was working. Another one, which we use quite a bit with my students, is that we would take the training data, and then we would train autoencoder, which would model the output from the neural net, and then while it was run on the training data, and then when we use it on the test data, we just looked how well the prediction from the autoencoder was working. So if the autoencoder didn't work very well, we knew that our result is not very good, and when we optimized that, that was somehow helpful. This is what Harish Malidi tried to do at the time. So he was getting, with stream dropping, he got 9.9%, but he got improvement. 9.96 is nothing to write home about, but it was certainly going in the right direction. So it was supportive to what we are after. So if you have a reasonable performance monitoring loop in your system, you may get a better result. If you selected the bands through Oracle, meaning you picked up the best one, you get 7.9. So obviously we still have a ways to go between 9.6 and 7.9, but it was doing reasonably well. So at the end, Harish got his PhD, and I think he's happily working for Amazon now. So, just to conclude, this is where we were. This is what Petya was showing you yesterday. And in 2011, I felt when we start looking into these dynamics of speech, we felt if we start looking more in speech dynamics, maybe we will get the new ASR techniques. And maybe co-articulation may be actually recognized as a useful thing. And maybe some of the top-down constraints, language constraints may not be as strong. Maybe we can rely much more on the signal itself. And maybe the robustness in presence of reasonable distortions may become a reality. That was 2011, right? And this is what we are using now. So what we fit into the recognizer, we use long segments of the signal. Deep neural net is structured so that it can use these raw segments of the signals, but 10 seconds is normal now. What we know, we have a frequency selective lower layers. Self-supervised trainings, leaving out part of the spectrotemporal plane is normal. It's basically giving us a good result. If we use the technique which I talked to you about on human hearing on the deep neural net, this is what you may start seeing. As you go through the layers, integration window keeps increasing all the way up to about 400 milliseconds in the last layers. This is a technique which has been used on humans, and now the same people actually applied it on the NIMAS people, of course, no surprise, right? Applied it on neural nets. Very surprising. So this is, just to remind you, this is what humans are doing. This is what the neural net is doing. This is something which I picked up from Shinji and his people. When you look at the pattern, or attention patterns, you see a number of patterns which actually do pay attention to about several hundred milliseconds. Some of them are narrower, but this is from Shinji's paper, so blame him if, so seems like the number of things in self-supervised training, wave to wake, estimate missing 200 milliseconds, which is masked, contrastive predictive coding, predict future, 120 to 200 milliseconds. This is what Katja was telling us. I mean, in this part, we can still hope that we can see that we have some hope to predict things within this window span, right? So Katja could have predicted this. So is speech recognition hard? It still is hard. I mean, of course, we want to keep a job. So we always figure out some corner where things do not work quite well, right? Sometimes I feel that steps like moving into longer segments of signal, employing a signal and dynamics, which we almost totally ignored before. We use it in such a weird way called hidden Markov model. Finally, we are getting there. I think that success of deep current techniques in speech recognition is largely because people start looking into dynamics of speech, using longer segments of speech for recognizing things, not chopping things into pieces, but looking at the longer segments of signal. The reason I spend a little bit of time telling you about frequency domain linear prediction is that if you start using it, you are guaranteed that you get at least as good result as from a spectrum, but it will force you to stay in time domain because that's your results will be in. So I think this will be useful. Still, I feel that we may be doing something wrong. There may be more steps which we are missing, which can help us to move, you know. So if you look here at the Roman letters, you admit that long division is hard. But if you sort of just change representation, change the way you are looking at the problem, suddenly long division is a piece of cake. So I think that something like that may be happening in a speech. If you look at the history of astronomy, history of the solar system, for the longest time people believed that things are moving around the Earth, and only Copernicus suggested carefully that it may be not exactly so. Galileo, of course, discovered very quickly that it must be that things are moving around the sun, because when observing the phases of Venus, it was beyond the doubt. However, when they used the new model, old model was pretty complex. They used the movements of planets using about 40 epicycles, and the new model of the movement of the Mars needed 48 epicycles. Basically, model didn't fit it that well. So people say, obviously, I mean, you know, Copernicus may be right. Now, Copernicus' idea is interesting, but it must be wrong, because we are not getting such a good result. It's true, actually. People were saying that. You know, because our old model, which is geocentric, where we keep the Earth in the center of the solar system, fits better. Of course, they got it wrong because they forgot a small little thing, that the movements are not along around the circles, but they move in ellipses. The moment they start using ellipses, picture of the solar system became beautiful. And that allows Isaac Newton to look into that and discover the forces of gravity. Because he also figured out why the ellipses. Kepler didn't know it, but Kepler described it. Newton, they knew why the things are doing it. So, this is probably my last slide, I promise. Well, almost last. We shouldn't be just keeping going down and improving error rates. Because it may get us to the point which is called local optimum, and we have to push up. And a long time ago, we wrote a paper towards increasing error rate, which actually meant, don't worry if your error rates are increasing as long as you believe into what you are doing. And I still believe in it very much. Because you may be in a position where the solar system people, where you're getting worse error, but you are on the right track. Because there may be always around the corner something else, right? But you have to be able to push up. And you have to be able to get out of this paradigm that you keep improving error rates. So if you gave me the opportunity to speak to you for 3 hours, and I know for a while it was tiring for me too, but I just wanted to get to this point. And you never know until if it works until you are done. Until then, you only know what doesn't work. But you have to basically, don't be afraid to get into something which doesn't work. You know, if I hear people, oh, I tried it and it doesn't work, I can't hear it unless I know why it doesn't work. You know, if I tried it and it doesn't work and you don't tell me why it doesn't work, you just wasted your time. I'm sorry. So, because if you learn why it doesn't work, then maybe the next step is to figure out how to get a little bit further, right? Why it works. So this is all what I wanted to say, pretty much. How to get there? Of course, we need mathematics. Of course, we need the computers. But we also need a little bit of understanding of what we are working with, speech. And we need to be a little bit scientists. John Pierce was criticizing speech recognition people very badly because he said he behaved like mad scientists or untrustworthy engineers. But he said, you know, it can work as long as they design good experiments that we can move step by step. But I still think that these two things should be basically go together. It shouldn't be just engineering. There's a lot of knowledge actually in human information processing, which actually can at least tell us a little bit where to go. Because, and that's something, please trust me, I'm an engineer, I'm not a neuroscientist. So I only borrow from them whatever I feel that can be helpful. But I see more and more things which actually can be helpful. You know, there are people who are very, very good in neuroscience, and we're getting closer and closer. I mean, I picked up few examples where I think that our systems are actually working more and more like human systems. A lot of people spend the time now looking, because now we discovered that competing with Googles and Amazons of this world is hard if you are in academia, but which is not hard to be smart. It is not hard to take the trained system and try to figure out what it is doing. And it's not hard to suggest the improvements. And if the improvement is such as like spec.org, you know, everybody starts using it and everybody starts thinking towards alternative things. And for this, you don't need to run a big experiment. But small experiments may be enough. Okay, on this, I think I'm through on the here. I didn't take any break, I apologize. At a certain point I realized I made a mistake maybe because I was getting tired myself. But, so if it was confusing at times, I apologize. Next time I should start from the back and go to the beginning, but it wouldn't work. But thank you for opportunity to talk to you because I know you are engineers, just as am I. But sometimes I say, well, I'm an engineer, but I managed in my life to be paid for what I like to do, even by pretending that I'm improving speech recognizers. And sometimes we improved a little bit, but. Thanks.
Hey. Oh, right now. How the spectral for hearing, like the trapezoid shape, how is it differ from constant Q in terms of theory? I mean,
they are clearly differences. The main difference would be asymmetry, because as I was showing you, the masking patterns suggest that there is more masking, spread of masking towards low frequencies. So the low frequencies influence high frequencies do not influence low frequencies. And we did some optimization, actually, Vijay Pedinti, who used to be my student, he optimized and he claimed that he got the best result when he put in these asymmetries, though differences are not very large, quite frankly. But it doesn't cost you anything, because it's just a different formula. It's not any more expensive. So I just put it up because who knows, I mean, but these improvements are not on the order of self-supervised learning, right? So, but self-supervised learning may help us to suggest which, yeah.
And related to this, how do you think about speech chain and having the loop within the learning of self-supervised, so having like reinforcement learning, mapping the speech chain, old theory?
Speech chain, as I know it, is...
Like in speech science, that's you speak and you adapt while the cortex adapts.
Oh, I see, about this feedback. Oh, boy, I mean, the way I feel about it is that for some reason, we have 100 million neurons in the auditory cortex, out of which about 5% are used and 95% are sleeping. But of course, when you change the task, another 5% are used and the other ones are sleeping. So there must be some mechanism of deciding which neurons are sleeping and which neurons might be using. There is definitely feedback from the cortex into the rest of the system. So why would it be there if it wasn't used for something? Truth is that we know very little about it, but we should at least think about it. My engineering stupid way of dealing with that is that I will design many parallel processing streams. You know, if I'm rich and I have a lot of computers, a lot of students, and a lot of data, I will design many parallel streams, and then I will pick up and train them all on a good speech, and then I will assume that I will pick up the ones which are appropriate for the given situation. So if I corrupt half of the spectrum, I will not use the channels which are paying attention to this corrupted spectrum. If I corrupt fast changes, I will not be paying attention to channels which are sensitive to fast changes. If I corrupt small changes, I will not pay attention to the streams which are describing slow changes. Essentially, I will, in order to make it fast enough, I have to have pre-computed channels. I don't think that it happens. And actually, I quite honestly see it doesn't happen in the real time that you move the properties of the neurons. No, you pick up the right neurons. They are all there. They are sleeping. So that fascinates me. The first time I learned about it, and actually there was a guy who is now in Bratislava, by the way, who did this work in New England, that they discovered that only 5% of neurons are used. And so why is that? I mean, if the Mother Nature provides for something like this, there must be a reason, right? Neurons are expensive.
Like in the mixture of experts.
Mixture of experts, well, mixture of experts plus means for knowing which ones to pick up. And for this, we need to know how to tell the good result from the bad one, without knowing what the results should be, without the labels. So this, I think, is always, whenever I give a talk, I said, this is a part which we need to work on. We need to work on techniques, how to tell the good result from the bad one without knowing the ground truth. And we worked on it a little bit. I didn't have much time, and there was a point where I was getting really tired, so I thought, oh, I wish it was already over. But we worked on it for a long time. I don't think we got a very good result. Actually, it was... Alex hopefully will help me because he feels, you know, one technique is that what I feel is that I do get a system which works very well, which is the system which is trained on used on its training data. If I train the system, then I take this very training data and run it through the system, then I will get various parameters out of the system, and I can build models of these parameters. And once I have models of these parameters, then I can fit these models to the data which I'm getting during inference. And if the fit is good, I say I'm happy. I can't do any better than the system on which it was trained. Sure. The closer I get, better I am. So this is currently my biggest hope. But if it works or not, I mean, I would like to say now, I'm 79 this year, so it's up to you guys.
Thank you very much. I have one more question regarding the time domain and the shifts. Do you think, because those are some of the experiments were given on a telephonical phone audio, and right now there are a lot of work regarding emotion, speech with talk with emotion, and is it still valid like this 200 milliseconds or 100, or is it more dynamic in terms of like emotional speech?
I think that the emotions are really dynamic. Very often, maybe, defining emotion is a pain to begin with, right? I mean, because I know I have a friend who, more mad he is, more quietly and more slowly and more peacefully he speaks. But I know, since I know him, I know that when he speaks Hynek, I think, you know, I know he's mad. But, you know, I scream, I mean, if I that's what students know, right? So emotions is difficult. I wish I don't want to work on it.
Yeah, it's difficult. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And
it's just a quick question. It might be something that is obvious. I'm an undergrad, so I don't know the exact answer. You mentioned in a slide, you were talking, you had these two spectrograms of an adult saying something and a child saying something, and then you did something to them where you generalized them and they looked the same.
Okay, well, yeah, I made it very short because this is, I know exactly what you're talking about. So that was massive. That was first everything what we knew about the human hearing at the time, spectral processing, plus very heavy-duty smoothing of the spectrum, made it looking this way. Yeah, this is the. Sorry, you are, yeah. Sanji must have seen it many times in his life. Yeah. So this is you know, this is a very old experiment because this is 40-year-old child. This is me, of course.
You are Yo-Yo.
This 40-year-old child is now 40 years old. Yeah, so that was my daughter. But what happens is that this is an extreme situation where you have very high fundamental frequency and formants in very wrong places. Because where I had a fourth formant, she had a second formant. So this is one example where clearly spectrum is nonsense, right? But heavy smoothing, which has been, it was emulated basically by heavily smoothing the spectrum using critical bands and compression, root compressions and pre-emphasis and very low model ordering. So it was, but this, by the way, this spectrum actually at the time, it works reasonably well. It's not 80 component spectrum, it's 5 component. It was model, fifth order model. So 2-peak model, which some people hypothesize this is all what we need. But
yeah, no, thank you. I was really curious just how that.
yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? I have a question that is intriguing me for a long time, actually. I keep listening to Hynek's talks for many years. And the thing that always really excites me are these feedback neurons, you know, that are actively influencing your hearing and the cortex and everything. Now, some 10 years back, we had these linear speech recognition systems that basically didn't have anything like this. But now we have attention. So the attention that, in my stupid understanding, because I'm more manager than engineer these times, basically influences the previous blocks and makes them listen or attend to what the following blocks are needing, and there are all these self-attentions and cross-attentions. So have you or anyone ever thought of relating these attention mechanisms to this auditory or other brain feedback? Anyone that managed to compare it with some functional MRI or stuff like this? I think this is an area where maybe we can connect the two worlds that you were speaking on the very last slide.
I didn't, because mainly I'm really not up to date for the latest and greatest. I was very happy when we had a Shinji Watanabe coming and he was working on attention, but then he left and then I left. and so no, but I believe that these feedback loops are the difference between Roman numerals and Arabic numerals. If you know how to modify your system while you are using it, that would make a big difference, I think. And, you know, I was just talking to a friend who is a computer science / neuroscientist / human processing person. And I was asking her, I mean, is anybody working on that? And she didn't know, you know? Because I said, why don't people work on modifying a system during inference? Because it's hard, because, you know, during inference we don't know the grand truth, but we know something. I mean, so I think that if people work on it, that would be great. I think that would really make a lot of difference. That may be this pushing up towards the increasing error rates in the right direction.
Yeah. I think I would need guys that are actively working with the attention models, like the guys not paying attention now, sitting in the back row. But I think this is probably something where we can relate. Well, surely it's not going to change the physical properties of the systems. It's still going to work with the WAV file or with the text or with image. But I think that we are somewhere in a way that the system can influence its own behavior and adapt it to what it sees or reads or listens to.
Yes, our naive way of doing is this multi-stream. It's a naive way. I agree. But it's yeah. No, thank you, Onzo. I picked up the right boss, you know.
The boss should do more thinking and less Excel tables. But,
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, that sounds scary.
Actually, maybe it is a question. The comment was you talked about Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton. We are in Brno. Do you want to mention Tycho Brahe?
Tycho Brahe wasn't in Brno. Tycho Brahe was in Prague, and who actually was worthwhile. Well, Tycho Brahe was just collecting the data.
I was about to
Tycho
say.
Brahe
data.
was like people who, I shouldn't say, but people who collected the Libre speech. but we needed Kepler. and after we had the Kepler, we needed Newton. And no, but Kepler was, of course, in Prague. Kepler came to Prague to steal Tycho Brahe's data, some people suspect, because he knew about the data, was extremely valuable. Tycho Brahe spent a life, and he had a rich founders. He spent a life in Denmark and then moving to Prague, collecting the data. No, actually, he collected data in Denmark and he brought it all with him. And Kepler knew that. Kepler was a poor guy, but smart. So he came and he was hanging around and waiting until the Tycho Brahe died. And then actually part of the data ended up with his relatives who had no idea what they had. And somehow he managed to get it out, and that's why he got these ellipses. Kepler's laws.
Yeah, because I remember seeing some instruments in the museum here in Brno. I think they're Tycho Brahe's instruments.
Yeah, but no, Tycho Brahe, well, maybe I would be surprised if he made it to Brno. There was in the days people didn't travel so as easily as now. He was in Prague, that's for sure. Actually, yeah, he was, I think, on the court even. And Kepler, I know where his house was. I show you sometimes. Yeah, not too far from castle. Thank you. That wasn't a bad question. Well, I will be here, so I will. So.